Okay, morning folks. This is our first lesson on unseen poetry, and today we're going to focus on reading and annotating an unknown poem, or an unseen poem. So please get your paper and your pen, get your title down, get your learning objective down, make sure it's underlined, make sure it looks beautiful, make sure it's neat, make sure you're ready to go. Learning objective today is to explore how a poet can describe a transformative moment of joy and wonder through metaphor and simile. And if we're talking about something that's transformative, it changes forever. It's a moment in your life that's, from there on in, it's never the same. So there are some things you're going to need for today's lesson. The first one is to remember your versatile vocabulary. So we've already had a look at chaos and at order. Okay, they're versatile because you can use them for any poem, you can use them for any text, you can use them for any character. So we're going to work on using those today. Also, if you're feeling particularly smart, we're going to think about some of the words that we've learned for an inspector course. So we want a veneer, superficial, and idealized. The veneer, we're talking about presenting something or someone as better than it really is, whilst hiding its true self. Superficial, something that's only interested, or someone that's only interested in surface level things. And idealized, this idea of presenting something as perfect. Okay, the best it could possibly be. So these are the words we're going to use to attack this poem, and the more vocabulary that you have, the easier it is to attack a poem, to talk about a poem, but then also to write about it afterwards. So if we're talking about reading an unseen poem, there are two things really that you need to do, and that's you've got your first read through, and don't annotate anything when you do this. It's just to get a handle on what the poem is about and what's going on in it. And if you're trying to annotate whilst you're doing that, it becomes really hard and really messy. Your second read through, that's when you can start making some annotations about the big ideas in each of the stanzas. We don't want to go into the real deep annotations just yet at all, but I'm going to show you that today. And we're going to, after we've done that, we're going to clarify like who is the speaker and what's the tone and what's happening. So I'll leave that for a second. Our third read, therefore, will be our annotations. And we're going to be specifically looking at metaphor and simile today. But I will also always talk about some verbs, because there are some cracking verbs in this poem that will really open it up to us if we look at them in depth. So the poem we're going to look at today, when it comes into focus, which it does not want to, it's called You Being Born, and it's by Brian Jones. Let's see if we can just get that to come back. The poem we're going to look at first of all is called You Being Born. It's called by Brian Jones. So let's give it our first read. No annotations, just reading the poem, understanding what the big ideas are before we go back into it again. I saw you born. It was remarkable. You shot out from between your mother's legs like a rugby ball from a scrum, and the stocky Geordie midwife caught you neatly and cried, "Whoops, she's come." You, You had a wrinkled, jammy head and spasmy legs like a portly frog's. From your belly button, a white root waved that had fed you all the months you had grown and ripened in your mother's womb. And let me tell you, I'm ashamed. I forgot your mother completely. She had been those things to me that one day you'll discover in someone else and think, God, this is it. My sweetheart, my warm dear, my red-hot lover. But for those moments, as the doctor shoved cotton wool up your flat nose and swabbed your eyes and cleaned your bum, I forgot completely all about all my life and love and watched you like a pool of growing light and whispered to myself, she's come, she's come. Okay, so that's that first read through. So from that we can probably work out some pretty important things. Okay, first detail, the speaker. Okay, who is it that's telling the story of this poem? It's not the poet, it's the voice that the poet takes on. And we know it's a parent at the birth of their child, probably a father. And the second one, we can probably work out the tone. Pretty joyful, but also the kind of sense of wonder. Now we want to go back. We're thinking, all right, what are each of the stanzas about? So we have our first stanza here. I saw you born, it was remarkable. You shot out from between your mother's legs like a rugby ball from a scrum. And this midwife catches the child. So this is it. This is kind of like the moment and action of birth. And as we go down, we have this description of the wrinkled jammy head, the spasmy legs, the button and the root, the belly button and the root. So we have the description of the child, the first time he ever sees it. And then we have these two stanzas under here, kind of talking about how he forgot your mother completely, he forgot his wife, and how now this child is the pool of growing light. So there's this moment of transformation from just a couple to being parents, for just loving the wife to loving the wife and the child. Child becomes central. So those are the main areas of the poem. We're thinking about now, okay, how does this poet present birth? So let's get the question down in our books, because that's what we're going to get into in a little bit more detail when we do our analysis. How does the poet present birth in you being born? Probably should give it a question mark. Okay. So our learning objective says that we're gonna focus on metaphor and simile here. So now we need to go back through and have a look. Okay, well, which similes and which metaphors, and also to a certain extent which verbs, does the poet use, and what's the effect of those? So I understand that not all of you guys will have a copy of the poem. So after we've chosen them, we're gonna write them into our books and we're gonna annotate them together. So if we look at the first stanza, there's There's a cracking one here, this idea of you shot out from between your mother's legs like a rugby ball from a scrum. So I'm definitely going to take that. That is it's a really rich quote. It's a really ripe quote. There's a lot in it we can talk about. Then the next stanza got this idea of a wrinkled jamly head and spasmy legs like a portly frog's. Again, really rich quote. But there's another really good one in here too. This idea of a white root that waved, that had fed you. I also really like this verb here, ripened, this idea of ripened linking to the root. We'll get to that in a second. And then there's a few more verbs that I think are really great as we go through this idea of shoved cotton wool up your flat nose, swabbed your eyes, cleaned your bum. Okay, so we're going to have a look at that one today as well, because I think that will tell us a lot about birth. And then lastly, we've got this watched you like a pool of growing light. So those are the ones we're going to attack. Okay. First of all, let's go for you shot from between your mother's legs like a rugby ball from a scrum. So the first quote I want to look at is this one here. This idea of shot. Now if we think about the verb shot, we normally think about, we think about a gun going off, firing a bullet. It's a terrible picture of a gun, but you get the idea. So if we're thinking about the verb shot, what does it tell us about number one? And this is where you write down your ideas. What does it tell us about the speed of the birth? Give me two things. Okay, the pace of it. Is it slow? Is it fast? Okay, once you've done that, I want you to then think about, what does it tell you about the emotions that this father is going through? So give me two adjectives to describe the emotions just from the verb shot. So we've got two things it tells us about the speed, two things it tells us about the emotion that he's feeling. Because I guess the poet could have said rolled out, or squeezed out, or crept out, or fell out, but he didn't. He says shot, okay? And he wants to get something, a point across, by choosing that word. The next quote I want to have a look at, or the next part of the same quote, is like a rugby ball from a scrum. There's loads of useful things in this one. Okay, so the child itself, let's think about, rather than what a rugby ball looks like and what a scrum is for the moment, let's just think about rugby itself, okay? Rugby, I guess, here is the metaphor. This whole thing is a simile. So rugby, what type of a game is it? Is it a refined game? Is it a calm game? Or is it something different? Okay, think about the words that we've used at the beginning of the lesson, order and chaos. Is it an ordered game or a chaotic game? Is it a calm game, or is it a polite game, or is it something else? Okay, so give me two ideas about the type of game rugby is. Then what I want you to think about is, if you're at a rugby game, what type of noise and sounds do you hear? And how could that tell us something about birth? What noise do the men or women make when they're tackled, when they're running, when they're passing or kicking the ball? How could that link in? And then we have this idea of the rugby ball. guess ultimately, what is it that the people in a game of rugby want? What is it that they're after? It's the ball. So what do they need to do to that ball? They're chasing after it because it is their what? Why do they want it? What does it help them to do? Once they get it, are they careless with it? Or are they something else? So write down 2 ideas for that. The final bit that really tells us something about birth here is this idea of a scrum. So if you don't play a lot of rugby or don't watch a lot of rugby, that's normal, that's fine. A scrum is where you roughly have 7 very large, very strong, heaving men pushing against 7 very strong, very large, heaving other men to win the ball. These guys tend to be very tall in the middle. So you have your first group of men on this side, and they're all pushing in this direction. Then you have your second group of men on this side, all crouched down, all linked together, all pushing as hard as they can. And these guys are pushing this way. And then in here somewhere, there's a little rugby ball that they both want. A scrum pushes forward, and they're both after something. Okay? How would you describe this scrum? Is it weak? Or is it something else? Who could the scrum represent? Okay. And also, the final idea is why a scrum at all? Who is watching this in the poem? Who is watching this event? And why is that important? We're watching the act of birth, which is very feminine, but then we have this image of the scrum, which comes from a different perspective. So why a scrum at all? Write your idea down why it has to be a scrum, based on who's telling this tale, the father. Right. Let's move on to the next one that we said we'd have a look at. And this idea is from the second stanza. This is the idea of this little jammy head. I quite like this, okay, because actually this adjective jammy, it's symbolic of something, right? And what's a baby's head covered in normally? Well, that's kind of obvious, right? But jam, what does it taste of? Okay, give me 2 things that it tastes of. Now, why is that important? Thinking about that flavour, that taste, how does that link to a child? Give me 2 ideas. Now I'll draw my little strawberry at the top. Strawberry jam. Moving on down, we get 2 more really good pieces of imagery. We've got this, one of these spasmy legs. Definitely more than one. And then we've got this other one that's linked to it, like a portly frogs. Now, if you spasm, you move uncontrollably. You can't control yourself. Why is that important? Give me 2 reasons that this child can't control itself. Is that a strong child? Or is that a vulnerable child? And then you've got this really strange image of a portly frog. Portly means quite fat. But normally we might idealize birth and children. Is this the perfect version of a child? A frog with big fat frog's legs? No, probably not. Okay, it's kind of the opposite. Frogs are normally quite slimy, they're amphibians, they're not human. Why would you want to describe something as like a little fat frog? Give me 2 reasons. Then, thinking about the vocabulary from the beginning, the word that means that people don't care about important things, they're fake, they might only look at surface level things. Is this a superficial moment or not? And then think about why the poet does this. Now give me 1 reason why the poet does this. We have this idea of reality versus perfection. Does the poet really care about perfection here? Then we have this next idea of the child is in stanza 3 has been ripened in the mother's womb. Okay. First one, what does this mean? If a fruit ripens, or a banana ripens, or an apple ripens, write down what ripens means. But really, if the mother helps the child to ripen, what is she helping it to do? Okay, what is she giving it? So give me 1 thing that she gives the child, and give me a second thing that tells him what that helps the child to do. Now, I've forgotten one of the best quotes from stanza 2, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to think about that. It's this idea of a white root waved. A white root waved from the belly button. Okay, number 1, what is it that comes from a child's belly button? Okay, what is that thing? If you're good at science, you'll know it's an umbilical cord. Okay, and what does that do? It feeds the child in the womb. But it's described here as a root. Now, what does a root do? Or rather, a root is first what? Then a root does what? Then we think about if we make that bigger, we know that a root attaches to one of these. And if you're not sure what this is, because my drawing is not very good, it's a tree. And then underneath the tree, we have the roots. Okay. The roots here are attached to the bottom of the tree. We know that our root is attached to the child's belly button. So this must be which person or which character in the poem. And then the earth here that it feeds off must be which character. So tree equals who that is growing, or the tree which is growing equals who, and then the earth equals which person. And then this reveals, give me two things, 1 and 2. Okay, moving on to our last two bits. Okay, the first one is this idea in the final stanza of the baby being cleaned up. So the doctor shoved cotton wool up the nose, swabbed eyes, and cleaned your bum. Okay, think about the sound of those verbs and think about the actions themselves. Are they gentle or are they something else? So these verbs, they are gentle or they are something else. Okay, they are probably rough, right? Rough, medical. Give me two reasons why. Why would we contrast the joy of birth with being so rough and medical? Okay, now our very, very last quote. Okay, it's our simile, it's this idea of they watched you and watched you like a pool of growing light. So this pool of growing light represents who? Which character is the pool of light? Write their name or write what it is here. Now this simile there's quite a lot going on. But if we just take light itself, light is symbolic of what? Despair, unhappiness, or something else? Give me two things that light is symbolic of. But light and a small pool of growing light getting bigger and bigger, this idea of growing, kind of sounds to me like something else. So what about this thing here? Okay. What is it? Or rather, we know what it is. It's the sun. Hello, I'm the sun. Okay. How could a child be like a sun? Be like the sun? What does it bring? Or how does it make people feel? Give me two things that it makes people feel. Then when you've done that, what orbits the sun? What spins around it in space? Hello, 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 hello. What could be the things spinning around this sun? Which characters in the poem? Who are they? And what does that say about their universe? Okay, so who is it that orbits the sun? There could be two people here, or more. And what does that say about their universe? What's at the middle? Okay, there's probably loads more things that you could get out of that poem, but those are the things that we're going to have a look at. And those are the things that we're going to want to write about because they're the most interesting things.